Next thing, we just set the oil level. Oil level gauge. Just simply adjust this to the right level. Put it in here. Oh, needs a little bit more fluid. There we go. That's the noise I want to hear. Next, we put the spring in, and on the Showa, you got to be real careful on some of these. Sometimes there's an up and a down to a spring. Doesn't make any difference as far as the force is concerned, but this particular end has a taper on it, and this end is straight. On the Showas, the taper goes up. Nope. Before I do that, real quickly, because my next step here is to put the cap on. What you want to make sure that you do is you back off the rebound adjuster all the way off before you actually put the cap on, because what happens is if you have this screwed in too far and you tighten this down, you can actually jam the adjuster and actually ruin the adjuster down in the bottom. So just simply back the compression adjuster or the rebound adjuster screw out before you actually install the cap. Back to the spring. Lift that all the way up. Now, basically what I'm doing here is I'm putting pressure with my thumb this way, my finger that way, and that keeps the rebound rod from dropping. It dropped a little bit, but nothing we can't handle. The neat thing about the Showas here is I can just take this wrench, slide it in there, and screw the spring down. Now we take our cap. That. One thing again, this absolutely has to be spotless clean. Get all the oil off of there. Again, blue Loctite. Just a drop of it. Now we put the cap on. Now again, we use a torque wrench. This was the socket I was going to use before. That's all there is to that. Now we take it. And you can take a little bit of seal grease on this one too. And put it on that O-ring. And just put the cap on. Now, a couple things. One is the amount of torque that goes on this cap is 6 foot-pounds. 6 foot-pounds is the same amount of torque that a 6-millimeter wrench gets, or a 6-millimeter bolt gets. That's the ones with the 10-millimeter heads, okay? I see a lot of guys that absolutely just crank on these things. There's absolutely no need to crank on that. Okay, so let's say you don't have a fancy tool. Okay. Another way to check oil level is to just use a tape measure like a dipstick. And the easiest way that I've found is to actually take it and put it down to where an even number is red right at the edge. See there where it says 20? That's 200 millimeters. And then all I'd do is I'd pull it up, and then I'd read where it may be real hard to see, but the oil stops right there. So what you do is you take 200 minus, in this case where it says 95, 200 minus 95 is 105 millimeters. So that's what your oil level is. And so you can obviously take the fork and dump out a little or add a little, whatever you need to actually set your oil level properly. Another important thing to know is preload. Now on cartridge forks, it's a little bit difficult to figure out how much the preload is. But before we actually go into that, let's talk about what preload is. Now this may seem a little obvious to some of you guys, but the preload is actually the amount that the spring is compressed when it's installed. So the free length is actually the length uninstalled, just sitting here like this. The set length is the length when it is installed, and the preload is the difference between the two. So free length minus set length equals preload. Now on this particular fork, what we'll do is we'll measure the spring here, and it comes out to 513 millimeters. And then on the cartridge, we have this assembled and fully extended. Measure from where the spring rests on one end to where it rests on the other end, and it measures 507. So 507. So that's 6 millimeters of preload. Now normally, on most forks, we'll run about 10 millimeters of preload. We found that that works about best. But a little bit heavier bike, sometimes a little bit heavier rider, sometimes we'll run a little bit more. In order to change the preload, what we actually have to do is in the cap, we'll have to stack up some washers right in here. And you got to be real careful on cartridge forks that when you stack up a whole bunch of washers, you can actually get them to where they don't locate anymore. So they're sitting down here, and the preload washers can actually move over. Then when the fork bottoms out, they actually hit the tube, or the tube hits them as it comes up, and you can create all kinds of problems. That's about all there is as far as preload is concerned. That's a real easy way to measure them on cartridge forks. Only got a couple things left. One is to set the adjusters, and those go in. Screw these all the way in. That's the one in the middle, not the one on the side. Screw it all the way into where it just snugs down. You don't want to crank on this one either, so you can ruin the adjuster again. Then back it out. To the setting that's recommended, and you're set. Okay. You can also double check to make sure that there's no air built up in these forks. Take the bleed out. And when you might wonder, how could air build up in the fork when nothing's happened? Actually, from when that O-ring seals to when it drops all the way in, it actually can compress a little bit of the air inside there. The other thing too is if the fork has been compressed at all, when you put the cap on, you want to make sure that you take the screw out so that it lets air in. Next we go into the compression adjuster on the bottom. And do exactly the same thing as up on top. Set the adjuster, and you're almost done. This last step is absolutely critical. A little bit of contact cleaner. We get out our gold valve sticker. Well, that was pretty straightforward, wasn't it? In fact, that's one of the points. This stuff's pretty simple. With a few basic tools and a couple of more advanced tools, anyone can do this. Now we're doing a whole series of tapes, everything which will include everything from shock gold valve installation, shock theory, basic theory of suspension, advanced suspension theory, troubleshooting and tuning, to secrets of race tech. Now if I were you, the first thing I'd be thinking is, why? Well, think of it. As far as I'm concerned, the better your bike works, The more gold valves there are out there installed, whether you install them or whether I install them, the better. Now, another thing that we have to offer is a technical hotline. So that if you have any trouble at any time with tuning or any particular problem, feel free to give us a call down at Racetech. Thanks for taking this time. See you at the races.